So I previously made a video on my channel where I reviewed a bunch of Apocalypse Party titles, and in that video I explained how I was quite taken by this indie press and their ability to just find the most mind-bending, sort of genre-warping works of horror out there. And in fact, I feel like a lot of these publications that they have, maybe the authors or the press themselves wouldn't really be comfortable or convinced enough to call them horror or belong into the horror genre, but everything I have read from Apocalypse Party, or virtually almost everything, has made me go, I'm so happy that the horror genre is still alive and well and putting out challenging and inventive and experimental works like this. So to me, they're a horror book indie press. I don't know if they see themselves this way, but they certainly play with a lot of the same thematics that a lot of horror books do. You know, there's a lot of nihilism, bleakness, confrontations with the uncanny, the abject. There is a lot of Lovecraftian sort of flirtations with the supernatural and sublime in some of the books that I've read by them. So I've just been really enjoying them. And it's kind of like the main source of indie horror that I've been receiving lately. And more important than that, I feel like they really serve of a transgressive kind of horror with a more confrontational, transgressive edge. And that I do also find is severely lacking in other areas of the genre, except for extreme horror. But I mean, you all know by now how I've generally felt about works that classify themselves in that category. But anyway, here I am with 3 more Apocalypse Party titles that I would call incredibly disturbing and transgressive indie horror books. Authors or the press themselves might contest this, like I said, and it's perfectly fine. I mean, defining genres and books that belong to these genres is always very freeform, right? But let's go ahead and get started. I want to review these because they really all blew me away, all 3 of them. And they all have something very different to offer. But again, in true Apocalypse Party fashion, there is a cohesion of putrescence and deviant minds, just sinister psychologies, just an uncanny sense that something is off. I think that's what ties all of these together, aka incredible literature. So let's get into it. The first one that I'm going to be reviewing here is Abnormal Statistics by Max Booth III. And this is a short story collection. This is an indie author that I believe I have heard their name somewhere else. I don't know if they were published through Weird Punk Books or have some kind of association with that. I've seen another of their books floating around, is basically what I'm saying. But this is their first publication with Apocalypse Party, and I am hoping it's not the last. This was a phenomenal short story collection. In particular, the first short story on here, which is actually more of a novella in terms of length, it's called Indiana Death Song. That story absolutely blew me away. I'm just like, whatever short story prizes they offer for the horror genre, I don't know if Bram Stoker does a prize for, indie horror collections or just horror anthologies. This deserves some kind of award for that story alone. I feel like, well, 1, it is truly unlike anything else I have ever read, but 2, it really exemplifies the kind of style that Max Booth III brings to the table, and a style that I see running throughout the rest of his work here. But admittedly, I do find that some of the stories were too short, or the balance between tonal shifts was not as well executed as that first one, but Indiana Death Song being sort of like the foray into the work of Max Booth III made me realize there is incredible talent here. There is incredible precision with the way that horror is delivered, because what this book does is it maneuvers quite a variety of tones in a way that quite honestly leaves me appalled as to how Max Booth III was able to do that. I often find that when I'm writing, I have to stick to just a certain kind of modality, and if I try to jump around between being serious and then unserious, sarcastic, funny, but then also sad, but then also melancholy, and it would be a fucking mess. But Indiana Death Song and some of the other stories in particular really sort of form an orchestra of tonal shifts in a really quirky, bizarre, kind of almost flirting with bizarro in a sense, or fully diving into it in some moments, in others. Magnificent to be at the hands of an author who is really bringing all their quirkiness onto the page. but in a way that's presentable, right? In a way that's easily sort of like easy to follow through and easy to comprehend, and also just shocking. There's revelations here, there's twists and turns, there's just so much at play here. This is fully formed to me as a horror short story collection, you know, within the conventions and the usual kind of plot structures that we see in the horror genre. All of that definitely is present here, but it's all tied together, like I said, by this position of, you know, Max Booth III saying, I want to bring the quirkiness, right? I want to bring the sort of off the beaten path kind of horror, and does it so masterfully. Like, what I'm trying to say here is, it's so rare to see a horror author sort of like burst into the scene with an already sort of like fully formed, unique tone and voice. A tone and voice that is just an amalgam of so many other things, like I've been saying. This is incredible, and this is what I love about Apocalypse Party, is that I had no preemptive knowledge of what this was or where it was coming from. If some of the stories were published somewhere else, I'm sure they were, but the Apocalypse Party just has this affinity to hurl these books out of nowhere onto my radar, and then I pick them up unassumingly, and then I'm just blown away. So this is incredible, and it has made me, you know, keep tabs on Max Booth III, see what else they're going to work on in the future, because my God, you know, if this is an early work, I can only imagine, you know, with more time and practice, what that kind of very unique sense of telling a horror story, where it will evolve, how it will evolve, what other, you know, zany, quirky, just absurdist kind of horrors are in store. All of that has me very excited. So abnormal statistics, incredible. Some stories, like I said, are better than others. There were, in my opinion here, a stinker or two, just being fully honest about that. But in terms of the overall cohesion and in terms of the stories that did work for me, they really packed a punch. And yeah, blown away by a lot of this book. So get it if you're interested in seeing where the horror genre is at today, basically. And the next book that I have for you all in this 3-book pile of indie transgressive horror, this is Visions by Troy James Weaver. And I have reviewed other works by Troy James Weaver here before. In that other video that I made featuring Apocalypse Party titles, I reviewed selected stories. And I also reviewed his other collection, Marigold, which is not published through Apocalypse Party, but which was my favorite of the 2 that I read by him, so I had to talk about it. Now, this is the 3rd work by Troy James Weaver that I've read, and I have to say, my favorite so far, and my favorite out of the 3 that I have here for you. So this is actually a story about a boy that is plagued by visions. It's even on the title. So 10 out of 10 right off the bat is what I'm trying to say. But there is so much more to it. So I feel like within the horror genre, you know, there's been auteurs who have really captured a sort of lightning in a bottle with some of their works, especially some of the earlier works, right? Like when we think of the seminal figures in the horror genre, they've all brought kind of like a unique aspect, you know, into the conversation, whether it's horror around the supernatural, around the unknown, horror around silence, horror around uncanny spaces, you know, horror around the eerie and the weird, all these things, right? Like it's often the labor of a lot of horror authors to explore existence, right? To explore the world at large and sort of figure what are the horrific movements that are being sort of orchestrated either subtly or loudly. And this, to me, it really brings the sort of like ultimate form to a story that explores the horrors in visions and after images and hallucinations. That kind of like borderline almost non-physical confrontation with visuals. It is just orchestrated so magnificently in here. So like I said, it's essentially the story of a boy who's being plagued by visions. That really is the larger chunk of it, but it's also about the relationships that he forges along the way, like very deviant, kind of off-putting, ill-defined, slippery relationships that he has with a female friend of his during his childhood, with an older teen, with the adults that surround him, and all of this sort of like building up his really, I have to say, kind of like almost sociopathic or definitely like socially stunted perception that he is a kind of savior that has to do something because of all the visions that they're experiencing. But the plan to do that is as ill-defined and vague as I am explaining it. And it's that ill-defined vagueness, again, that I think really just digs out the truly confrontational horror that is behind abstraction, that is behind images out of the corner of your eye. You know, there's a peripherality to the way the visions here are presented. They're often presented contained within their own chapters and you know, in italics, so separated from the text. And then they're not really ever really integrated into the rest of the narrative, but they kind of color the tinges of the really increasingly transgressive interactions that this young man is having with the people around him. But again, there's just such a steadiness and incisiveness to the prose of Troy James Weaver. What I've really loved about Troy James Weaver is that, well, you can see the length here, but in the other works that I've read by him, some of his pieces could even be classified as microfiction. I don't know if he really, you know, embraces that term or not. But, you know, flash fiction, microfiction, really short pieces that really work to do two things. They kind of amp up this sense of suffocation, right? Like a breathlessness. There's not so much, it's not really that there's not so much to say. There's just not so much that can be said, right? There's a struggle to sort of posit the reality of the narrative here in kind of like mortal terms. And that's what the stuntedness of the prose sort of brings, that kind of like really weird suffocating quality. But also I feel like it pushes Troy James Weaver as a kind of even mental exercise, you know, a kind of writing challenge of, well, there's a limited amount of words per chapter, and just bringing out so much impact and meaning and horror in such few words takes an incredible amount of talent. And more so than that, the inventiveness around, you know, how can you arrange 3 small sentences into a full-blown catastrophic, sublime, hellish set piece, for example. There are, you know, visions that are presented here that are just a paragraph long, but there's enough richness and uncanny nature to them to really bring them to life. So what I'm trying to say is basically playing with that idea that the main horrors, the core horrors that are in this book, are only ill-defined. You know, they're only faint after images, visions that are forgotten with wakefulness, that kind of thing. So trying to play up a horror story where the central horror is so evanescent and unclear takes real talent to orchestrate a truly effective story of what I would call Gothic horror here, you know, kind of even like with a Southern Gothic edge. Authors that came to mind while reading this were Flannery O'Connor and Reese DJ Pancake. So this was phenomenal, and it is truly an outstanding original work of horror to me, and it just tells me I cannot wait to see what else is going to come up with Mr. Troy James Weaver. This was mind-blowing and one of my favorite reads of 2023 so far. So if you get any of the 3 that I'm talking about in this video, I recommend this one the most. And last but absolutely not least, we're going to talk about the Yeager bomb, the Yeager master himself, B.R. Yeager, who I've reviewed here before. I did a standalone review of his first work, Amygdalatropolis, which was, to me, sort of like what Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke could have been, you know, the better version of that. And then also reviewed Negative Space, which was also an Apocalypse Party release, in that other video that I made. And now, B.R. Yeager comes at us with his new short story collection with the amazing title, Burn You the Fuck Alive. These are short stories told sometimes in a conventional sense of prose, other times they're experimental both in format and content. There's a lot of imagery in here, again, you know, like in typical sort of like transgressing even against the form of the book, right? In typical Apocalypse Party tradition. But Burn You the Fuck Alive, collection of short stories. I'm gonna admit right off the bat, this is not my favorite work of B.R. Yeager's so far. So far, that has been Negative Space, and I have sang that book its praises on and on, called it one of the best things I read in 2021. So I was excited to dive into this one, and while it was not my favorite, I was far from disappointed, because you basically just get a lot of that same sort of like windswept putrescence that you get out of the rest of B.R. Yeager's bibliography. So this is a collection of short stories that, to me, are sort of unified in that sort of nihilistic edge of really fucked up people trying to do something significant, really fucked up people trying to find love or a meaningfulness in what is otherwise a derelict existence that they've been forced into. And I feel like the title even kind of reflects that. You know, is that this confrontational kind of need to singe the boring contours of reality, you know, through aggression, because there's often nothing else that these characters have, like, you know, burn you the fuck alive kind of. It's kind of like this call to action, right? Almost like we're gonna light up with flames what is otherwise a bleak and stagnant existence, because there's nothing else to bring it to life. I'm just bullshitting a little bit, but that is truly what I felt in a lot of these stories. Lots of people that I'm just like, even therapy is not going to do anything here. Cleansing by fire truly is the only option in some of these cases. I will say there's some stories that play with the images in a heavier fashion than others, and those were my least favorite, I have to say. But there is a story in here, and I think it's the longest story in the collection, Poison Nurse, that I think really exemplified what I'm trying to say here, is that it's both a very melancholy and human portrait of a character. And that is what I always love about works that, you know, play on that transgressive edge, is that ultimately they reel us back into a sense of humanity. And that's what adds true weight to the horrors that unfold here. I felt that fully in here. And even though some of the stories didn't work, there is an overall mastery in the way that horror is delivered. And I find that B.R. Yeager, to me, is really kind of a wordsmith, but he's also very economical with the words that he uses. He's not like throwing out a flare, a flourish of thesaurus fueled purple language. No, it's more like there's a steadiness to the way that the horrors are delivered, and with everyday words, somehow he's able to draw out true horror out of these everyday quotidian images. There's just images, you know, regular old photographs or regular oral, you know, boring meetings at work, needles at a nurse's office, that kind of thing. But they are just infused with so much dread and horror. And that is the true talent that I feel B.R. Yeager has, is that he really plays with words like they are bullets a little bit. And I said this a little bit when I reviewed it on Goodreads, but admittedly, some of those words don't detonate for me as much as others, but the way that he has launched so many bullets through my fucking guts while I read his books has been absolutely phenomenal, and this did that quite a few times. So yeah, I am still convinced that the Yeager bomb is in full form here. You know, this is short stories. This is a new format for me to read him in. But I am convinced of his prowess as a novelist, and now I'm convinced that he is also a very competent short storyteller. And just have to say, like these other authors, I just simply can't wait to see what else is in store. But yeah, like the bleakness really is what you have to delight in when you pick this up. The bleakness and also the character portraits. You know, character work is very difficult to do, especially in horror, I find. Because horror is just so often, horror short stories are so often basically a long eulogy for your characters, right? Like they're gonna die, and you have to come to terms with the fact that you have to make these characters memorable enough so that their death is truly impactful. Doing that in short story form especially is incredibly difficult. But there is a really keen sense of nihilistic eulogizing, let's say, in a lot of these stories that really carried that humanity up in some of the stories here. So I was thoroughly impressed by some of the movements in here, as I was with the others. And again, the Yeager bomb is here, and I can't wait. Like, will they just keep playing with other forms of storytelling? Are they gonna hit us with a new novel? I don't know. I'm scared and excited. So yeah. So those are the Apocalypse Party titles that I've read since I did that other video and have been thoroughly impressed by them. I do own some others, so I'll be reading those eventually, and I'm sure other stuff is gonna come up that's gonna grab my interest. I am here to Ride or Die with Apocalypse Party 100%, and spread the word. If you're looking for indie horror that is much more inventive, experimental, transgressive, you're tired of like the same old body count kind of extreme horror that is mostly out there, I thoroughly recommend these, and I recommend that you also watch the other video that I did on other Apocalypse Party releases. But yeah, just really excited whenever a new one comes out from them that really grasps my attention, tells me you gotta read that. So yeah, thank you all so much, all the beautiful names that are scrolling across the screen for your donations, life-saving donations, might I add. Yeah, I hope you are all well. Continue to stay safe. I hope you pick up some of these, and let me know if you're also in the cult of Apocalypse Party, which titles that I may have missed or overlooked do you think I would really vibe with? I always want to hear about that. So yeah, hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.